So, without further ado, I will introduce, for those that don't know her, Liz Shakespeare. Liz draws her inspiration from the landscapes, the people and history of Devon, the family stories that she's grown up with, and the sense of being deeply rooted in this area, which has a very powerful influence on her writing. She's written 5 books set in North Devon, and Liz very much is about bringing to life the stories that she finds in the area, be that from old newspapers, from the parish records, from wandering around and finding things in the landscape, in cemeteries and so on gravestones. She's going to be talking today about her most recent book, The Postman Poet, which is a novel telling the story, the true story, of Edward Capern, who hailed from Bideford, but I'm not going to steal any more of the information about him by telling that now. Liz will deal with that very nicely on her own. So I will pass directly over to you, Liz. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Mark. Yes, so I'm going to tell you today about The Postman Poet, the true story, as Mark said, of Edward Capern. Well, I first heard of Edward Capern about 30 years ago, when an article about him appeared in the local newspaper. And the romance of the story stayed with me, the rural postman composing verses as he walked along the very same lanes that I walk. I wrote a little bit about him in my book, Fever, a story from a Devon churchyard. And when the idea came to me of writing a novel about his life, it really was a eureka moment. And I think in my writing life, I've never felt so certain about a project. Edward Capern was born in Tiverton in 1819. He was the eldest son of a baker. His family moved to Barnstaple when he was 3 years old, no doubt to provide for the many lace workers who were moving from Tiverton at that time to work in the new lace factory. His family were poor. Edward only ever went to school for 4 months. I'm going to read you a brief extract. There was only one book in his childhood home. The Bible was kept on a high shelf in the kitchen above the pots and pans, and Edward was the only one allowed to look at it because he was the eldest. Perhaps it was not often that his mother lifted it down for him, but in his memory he would have been racing through Barnstable's narrow streets with a gang of other boys, the October evening drawing in and smoke hanging above the terraced houses, until their mothers' voices called them in one by one. His mother would look up from her sewing as he came to sit at the candlelit table, and he would feel the warmth of her glance. Perhaps it was because of his fidgeting that she would put down her sewing and place a clean cloth on the table, reach up to the shelf and place the Bible in front of him, as carefully as if it were a delicate piece of china. The cover was heavy and creaked slightly as he opened it, releasing a sweet, earthy aroma. The writing on the first page was his mother's. When he looked at it in later years, he saw, with a rush of sympathy that brought tears to his eyes, that the letters were laboriously and badly formed. Her name and his father's were at the top. They both began with E, Elizabeth and Edward. His own name was underneath, along with the date of his birth. Thomas was next, and then his 2 little brothers, who had the word died next to their names. Then came his 2 sisters. He knew, although he had not been told, that there would soon be another name to add to the list. The pages were as delicate and rustling as autumn leaves. Sometimes he turned several at once, indiscriminately, to prove to himself that every single page contained as many words as the one before. He could read a lot of the words, and sometimes a whole sentence, but it was difficult to make a story unless his mother showed him where to start. So he would turn back to the first page and read again the story that he knew. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The words made him feel dizzy. He read them again and again, until his mother leaned over and found a passage for him, prompting him when he reached a difficult word, until he could match the words to her voice. When he was 9 years old, Edward was sent to work in Barnstable's Derby lace factory to help support the family. He usually worked a 14-hour day, and occasionally 20 hours when there were urgent orders to meet. When, after a few years, his work as a threading boy came to an end, he tried a variety of occupations: shoemaker, carpenter, French polisher, even portrait painter. But it seems he wasn't very good at any of them. There were very few opportunities for a young man with a thirst for knowledge. No public libraries, no evening classes, no way to improve his lot in life. Until the Barnstable Literary and Scientific Institution was opened in 1845 by William Frederick Rock, the Barnstable-born printer and philanthropist, after whom Rock Park was later named. Mr. Rock paid the annual membership fees for 100 poor men, enabling them to visit the institute after work, to read the books in the library and attend lectures. And Edward Capern was one of those men. Despite this development, times were hard. These were the 1840s, the hungry 40s as they were known. The new Poor Law was harshly administered. There were food riots in Barnstable and reports in the local newspapers of people starving to death. Edward struggled to find work. Eventually, he moved to Bideford, where conditions were somewhat easier, as the mayor and other benefactors were buying cheap American flour to sell at cost price to the poor. So after moving to Bideford, Edward was finally able to marry milliner Jane Trick, the girl he'd been courting for 8 long years. They lived at first at 28 Mill Street in Bideford, where the town council have recently erected a plaque on the wall to commemorate Capern's time there. But if you decide to go and look for this plaque, take your binoculars on, because they put it so high up on the wall you can hardly see it. There would have been no facilities in that little cottage at the time, just an earth closet in the backyard, which was shared with 3 other cottages, and of course no mains water. I studied old street maps to try and find out where Jane would have to have gone to fetch water. And I found, naturally enough, that she'd have gone just round the corner into Chingswell Street. And although that's a street name I've known all my life, it hadn't occurred to me before that it was called that because there were so many wells there. Edward was working as a French polisher, but it seemed that the repetitive work and the long hours of confinement didn't suit him. He and Jane had a son, born on their first wedding anniversary, but Jane struggled with ill health and money was in short supply. But then Edward was offered a job as a postman. Through research at the Royal Mail Museum in London, I was able to see details of this first appointment, for which he needed a recommendation from the Honourable John Fortescue MP, something which Mr. Rock probably helped to arrange. It wasn't a job which suited everyone. Literacy rates were low at this time, but Edward could read and write. Initially, he worked on the Bideford to Appledore round. He hardly needed a coat at all when he set off for Appledore for the first time. It was a beautiful May morning, and although his mind was much exercised with remembering Mr. Lee's instructions, his heart lifted as he walked through Potter's Lane and out of the town. He carried 2 locked bags of letters strapped across his chest, and a small bag to deliver to outlying houses along the way. On the way back, he would carry all the letters that were proffered to him, together with the pennies for their postage. He'd been given a bell to alert people to his approach, but for the time being, he'd wedged it upside down in the pocket of his Sunday coat, so that he did not ring it inadvertently. He had been issued with a book of instructions and knew that he must not make mistakes of any kind. The postman, who had walked the round for many years, had recently been charged with embezzling a penny. And although after a lengthy trial he was found not guilty, he was still dismissed from the post office. Edward strode out along the causeway that ran across the marsh. A gentleman riding a large cob towards Bideford greeted him cheerily. That would never happen if he were not recognised as a messenger working for the Queen. He started to whistle, marvelling that he could be paid for taking a walk on such a fine day. What a great invention was the penny post! Just a few years ago, Not many of these people could have afforded to receive a letter, but now thousands of letters were carried to the most remote regions of the kingdom by mail coach, by railway, and by foot, the volume of post multiplying daily as if written communication was being discovered for the first time. Letters of love and compassion, of urgent business, advice, and exchanges of ideas. And what a clever idea was the postage stamp, costing just 1 penny, bearing the image of the Queen. Sir Rowland Hill was indeed a great man to have brought such reforms into being, not least because he's created employment here in North Devon for Mr. Edward Capern, who was an integral part of the great web that was the post office, one of thousands of postmen at this moment, walking the streets and lanes of England. Later, he was given the Bideford to Buckland Brewer round. At this time, a new postal round was only created when the letters to that district averaged 100 a week. Until that time, people had to go into the town to pick up their mail. This new round was a 13-mile walk and involved a 2-hour wait in the village of Buckland Brewer to give people time to reply to the letters he delivered, so that he could then carry the replies back to Bideford again. At last, as he walked, he had time to work on the lines of poetry that had been running through his head. He developed a love of poetry while reading books in the Literary and Scientific Institution in Barnstaple. Oh, the postman's is as happy a life as anyone's, I trow, wandering away where dragonflies play and brooks sing soft and slow, and watching the lark as he soars on high to carol in yonder cloud. He sings in his labour, and why not I? The postman sings aloud. And many a brace of humble rhymes his pleasant soul hath made, of birds and flowers and happy times, in sunshine and in shade. These were happy times for Edward. He now had 2 children, Charles and little Milly, and a job he loved, despite the low pay. In Buckland Brewer, there was a comfortable cottage into which he'd been invited to sit and work on his poems in the middle of the day. And through research, I was able to identify this cottage. I knew that people in Buckland Brewer had always wondered which cottage it was. And by a strange quirk of fate, it turned out to be the very house where my friend and fellow historian, Janet Few, now lives. As Edward Capern walked, he found inspiration for his poems and songs in the landscape, the birds and flowers, and in the poem and the people that he met. And it wasn't long before he began to meet with success. A few early poems were published in the North Devon Journal, an achievement of which he must have been very proud. He could not, even at this time, afford to buy a newspaper himself. But as he walked, he used to carefully read any newspapers he had to deliver. But of course, he could only read the part of the folded newspaper that was exposed. Neither could he afford paper on which to write his poems. Paper was quite expensive at that time. So he scribbled the poems onto envelopes while leaning on a stile or gate as he walked his round. And then he asked the recipient of the envelope if he could have a sheet of paper to copy them out. Well, Mr. Rock offered to try to publish a volume of poems by subscription. This was the 19th century version of crowdfunding. And like today, it was a method used for projects that were first ventures to demonstrate that success was possible. So people would pay in advance for the book so that the publisher would know that he'd make enough money from it. Mr. Rock had many contacts in London, and he was successful in finding 500 subscribers. The book could be published. I have a copy of that first edition published in 1856, and the list of subscribers is in the back of the book. The names include the Prime Minister, 4 Dukes, 5 Earls, 6 Lords. They include Tennyson, Charles Dickens, and Rowland Hill, the inventor of the penny post. You can imagine, for a man who couldn't afford to buy books himself, what an exciting time this was. Edward turned down the track to Lancross Mill, whistling as he walked. It was a fine June morning, and the sky was of the deepest blue when observed through the bright green foliage of the oaks. He had to shield his eyes from the sun, which was just beginning to lift the dew from the grass, and to draw flashes of light from the River Yeo, rippling over its stony bed. What a time it had been! The thrill of holding his book in his hands really was as great as holding his children for the first time, although Jane was rather affronted when he said so. He could caress the green embossed cover and ran his finger over the spine, which announced Capern's Poems in gold lettering. It scarcely seemed possible that those words meant him. At first, the delight he took in his new book had been mingled with fear that reviewers would find the poems ridiculous. They would ask why a mere postman imagined he could write poetry. They would declare that flowers and birds were not worthy subjects. They would surely scorn the choice of words and the simple rhymes. But then, the first reviews were printed in the newspapers. Mr. Capern is a real poet, a man of genius of a very high order. His verse is as delicious in sentiment as it is melodious in utterance. He had almost fainted with astonishment. The reviews came from every county in England, as well as from the national press. And after the reviews came the orders. After only a few weeks, Mr. Rock told him that the 1,000 books were almost sold out, and there was to be a reprint. It was beyond his wildest dreams. Perhaps the greatest relief for him and for Jane was hearing that the first edition would bring a profit of £150, which Mr. Rock strongly recommended should be used to purchase an annuity on their joint lives. As they realised the significance of the news, they held each other and cried with relief. Never again need they worry about going hungry in old age. Never again would they fear dying in the workhouse. As he descended the steep path in the sunshine, grasshoppers leapt from under his feet and landed amongst the poppies that grew on the rocky edges. He crossed the bridge, pausing to watch the dark red cows drinking from the river shallows and the sunlight that flashed on the drips of water when the cattle lifted their heads to stare at him. He hummed a tune to himself as he continued on his way. He had composed half a dozen songs in the last few months. The truth was, it was not always enough to be writing words alone. He had so much joy in his heart that he needed music as well as poetry. There was more to come. The Prime Minister was so impressed with the patriotic poem, The Lion Flag of England, that he sent broadsheet copies to soldiers serving in the Crimea, and he awarded Edward a civil list pension of £40 a year for life, and this was when his weekly wage was 10 shillings and sixpence. It was no wonder the songs he wrote were joyful. Any of you who've read my previous books will know that I like to carry out detailed research to ensure that as far as possible I achieve historical accuracy, and there was certainly no shortage of material for this project. I found over 600 national newspaper articles about Edward Capern and 2 detailed accounts written by people who accompanied him on his postman's round. There was also research to be undertaken into the local and national events that affected his life, including the self-education movement, the coming of the railway to Bideford, the mass emigration from North Devon to America and Canada, and the development of the penny post. I even read books on 19th century millinery so that I could understand the work that his wife Jane did. But most important, perhaps, were the poems themselves. He went on to write 3 further books of poems, 600 in all, and close study of these books gave me a fascinating insight into the mind of their author and into the countryside between Bideford and Buckland Brewer through which he walked, and the people that he met. As I read the poems, I could just hear the clatter of watermills on the River Yeo and the birdsong. I could just picture the wildflowers that were more prolific than they are today. In one poem, 26 wildflowers are named in the first verse alone. So I drew extensively on the poems to help me develop Edward's character and understand his life. I've published a selection of the poems which were all out of print so that you can read them for yourself. I have 600 to choose from, so I've selected those which I feel have the greatest poetic merit, and also included those which I feel have particular interest in relation to Edward Capern himself and to the locality. As I studied the poems, it became increasingly clear that some of them were intended to be sung. I asked Devon musicians Nick Wyke and Becky Driscoll to look at the material, and they were so enthused by it that they've brought out a CD of the songs. So songs, they're proper Devon songs, which can now be heard again for the first time in 150 years. I think Edward would be pleased with what they've done. Certainly I am. And we go out together telling the story of the Postman Poet at literature festivals and music festivals. There are hints in the prefaces to Edward's books that he would like to have done more to raise awareness of social inequality. But William Rock would have advised him that his poetry would not find an audience if he offended those in positions of authority. His advice was sound for someone who wanted to be published. Capron was one of very few working class writers to become nationally known, to be given a civil list pension, and to eventually achieve financial independence through writing. In recognition of his commitment to social justice, for every copy of the poems I sell, I'm donating £1 to the North Devon Food Bank, and I've already been able to donate over £700. I know that Edward would be appalled to know that we need food banks now in the 21st century. His success brought him many advantages. The post office increased his pay from 10 shillings and sixpence a week to 13 shillings, and they relieved him of his Sunday duties. Post was delivered on a Sunday in those days. He no longer had to work 364 days a year with no paid holidays, except Christmas Day. He did get Christmas Day off. He could now spend Sundays with his family. And a couple of years later, he was given an allowance for a pony and cart, which not only transformed his work, but also allowed the family to travel further afield on a Sunday. And his poems and songs show us that they did just that. Edward Capern experienced a great personal tragedy in his life. You'll have to read the novel to find out what that was. But this influenced his and Jane's decision when he retired from the post office at the age of 46 to move away to Birmingham, where his son Charles had found employment in a bank, and indeed went on to become bank manager. Edward's success continued in the Midlands. He gave frequent lectures to working men's institutes, and his fourth book, Sungleams and Shadows, met with success. But his poems tell us that he never stopped missing Devon. This is a verse of a poem written in the Midlands. It's a tribute to Devonshire cream, which he was clearly missing at the time. Sweeter than the odours borne on southern gales comes the clotted nectar of my native vales. Bright and golden crusted, rich beyond compare, food on which a goddess evermore may fare. Burns may praise his haggis, Horace sing of wine, Hunt of Hibla honey, which he deemed divine. But in the Elysiums of the poet's dream, where is the delicious without Devon cream? Eventually, Edward and Jane moved back to Devon, bringing 2 young grandchildren with them, and they spent their last years near Braunton. Edward died in 1894, just 4 months after his beloved Jane. They are buried in Hinton Churchyard, which is set high on a hill with breathtaking views out across the Tor and Torridge estuaries. His postman's bell is incorporated in the headstone. When I visited the grave recently, a song thrush, which is one of the birds most often mentioned in Edward's poems, was singing from a nearby tree, and its song rang out across the churchyard, especially for him, it seemed to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was absolutely brilliant. We have just a little over 7 minutes of this session left to be able to pop in any questions. Emma has just typed one into the chat. As a Devonian yourself, says Emma, has Edward Capern's work inspired you to write any poetry of your own?
I'm afraid it has. No. I don't think I've written any poems since I was a teenager, but it has given me an increased appreciation, I think, of the Devonshire countryside. And I like to imagine him walking the lanes as I walk them myself. My house is actually on his postal round. He used to deliver to I live in an old cottage and he used to deliver here. So it's wonderful to imagine him doing that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emma. That's great. If anyone else wants to pop a question in the chat, please do so. Liz, you choose to self-publish all of your books rather than being traditionally published. Is that a conscious decision because you enjoy the whole process of publishing?
Yes, I do. I've been writing and self-publishing for 30 years now. My first book was actually published in 1990. And I'd like to take my time over it. I do a lot of research. So each book takes me at least 3 years to research and write, which is something I think a commercial publisher wouldn't be interested in. And I really enjoy the promotion and distribution side of it as well. This summer is rather different, but usually I go to all the Devon agricultural shows, for instance, doing book signings. I would have been at Devon County Show last month for 3 days, book signing, all cancelled of course. But I have been able to sell more books through my website. Quick plug for that, www.lizshakespeare.co.uk. You know, I do have a degree of independence through that.
How have you found promotion as well at this time?
Well, more difficult because I usually, as I say, I go out doing a lot of book signings. I also give a lot of talks to history groups, U3As, WIs. Of course, it's all stopped. So it's a bit of a challenge, to be honest. I think, you know, I'm hoping to get back to the old ways eventually. Don't think it'll be this year. But,
I think lots of authors are in the same position, aren't they, as well? There's a question from Ellen. What advice would you give a young writer looking at the possibility of self-publishing their work?
Well, it's a lot easier now than when I started in many ways. The whole process of self-publishing is easier. Promotion, I think, is still difficult because the market really is flooded. If you're trying to do it all online, there is so much out there. But for a young writer, I would say mostly write, keep writing, enjoy writing. And then you could try publishing as ebooks, find your way, use Facebook, see how it goes, you know. But most of all is the enjoy the writing.
Thank you, Ellen. I hope that answers that one for you. You've been self-publishing for a long time, Liz. Do you find that there's still any kind of stigma attached to it? Because at the time when you would have started that, vanity press, as it used to be called, was a big thing. And some authors still find that stigma of self-publishing, which really is irrelevant these days because lots of traditionally published books are print on demand and are published in exactly the same way. Do you find that stigma is still held by some places, particularly bookshops?
Well, I don't personally, because I've been doing it so long. I've got a following, so I have no problem getting the books into bookshops and other outlets. You know, I sell at various tourist places, like for instance Rosemore Garden, you know, sell actually a huge number of my books, and I'm in Waterstones and so on. So but I think that's because I've been writing for so long. I think there is still a stigma there. I think particularly people find difficulty with Waterstones quite often, and even I know my local bookshop, you know, they say that my books keep them afloat, but you know, I do know that it can be difficult for new authors going in. So I think it is still there, if I'm honest.
Did you choose to move into ebook publishing as well?
Yes, my books are available on Kindle, just on Kindle. That's quite a small percentage of my sales. They mostly are physical books, and I do quite big print runs. Although this year I've got a new book coming out in November, And I am thinking with the present climate, it's going to be a smaller print run than usual. It's going to be more like 1,500. My last one was 3,500. So, you know, because I don't know how it's going to be going. I think it might be a while, you know, before the sales reach the levels they have previously.
Yeah.
All my books have been reprinted, the earlier ones quite a few times, you know, but I'm sure we will get back to that again, but I think it's quite difficult times at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. I think that unpredictability is the case, isn't it, for any author? We have just a couple of minutes left, so that's just enough time for me to say again, if you want to go and investigate more of Liz's work and get hold of a copy of this or any other of Liz's books, then her website is in the chat there, www.lizshakespeare.co.uk will take you to all of Liz's work. Again, if you wish to make a donation to the library service to support events such as these, then the link for that is also in the chat, or you can just visit the library's Unlimited website and do so. In the meantime, with a minute and a half to go, I would just say we have one more talk this evening at 7 o'clock, which is Tracy Norman talking about a very unusual historic case from the Devon area, which might have been a crime, might be a witchcraft accusation, might be something entirely different. You'd have to come to the talk to find out exactly what it was. So you can still book for that one. Just email the library and we'll send you the meeting details for that one. In the meantime, please show your silenced through the power of muted microphones appreciation for Liz Shakespeare. Thank you very much, Liz.